Everybody. Wow, look at all of you. Thank you so much for coming out. This is exciting. Welcome to day one of my class called Quantum Faith. Part one today is called The Breakdown, and I'll tell you why a little bit later. This is content that has lived in my head for 3 years or so now. A few years ago, I just became absolutely enthralled with quantum physics and started to watch and read everything I could about it, and just kind of dove in deep. And as I did it, I was surprised at what I found and what it brought up in me and other aspects of my life that weren't scientific. So that's what I'm excited to talk to you all about today. And the next couple of weeks, which is awesome. This is my treat. I love being with my high schoolers more than anything. It's my favorite part, my favorite part of my life, not just my job, but it is super fun to come up here and do this with you. And someone like Elijah, who was in the high school group when I taught this 2 years ago, he'll be hearing this for the second time, even though it's condensed into a 3-week format. Before we get started, I have a couple disclaimers. The first disclaimer for this class: I am not a science teacher, much less a quantum physicist. I don't know what I'm talking about. That is the reality. In fact, if there are scientists in this room, would you please raise your hand? Okay, we got one up here. Tom's a scientist back here. Pat's she taught science. Okay, we got science teachers in here. I am not a scientist. If you are a scientist, feel free to offer at any point. If you have something to offer, feel free to raise your hand. We can bring a mic over to you. If you have something to contribute that I am missing or misunderstanding, it's going to happen because I am not a science teacher, much less a quantum physicist. And we're going to be talking about science and quantum physics over the next 3 weeks.
Rule 1 of quantum physics: somebody says they understand it, they don't understand it.
Rule 1: if someone says they understand quantum physics, they don't understand quantum physics. Who said that? Was it? It's attributed to a famous quantum physicist. I can't remember who. Anyway, disclaimer number 2. This is not a class where science proves God is real. If you go out and you try to read about something that has words like quantum and faith in it, you're probably going to find a bunch of books that dive into quantum physics and then show you how they prove the existence of a God. That's not what this class is. In fact, it's been kind of frustrating to create this class, and a lot of it is I don't want to say it's original information because I didn't invent quantum physics nor spirituality, but it's a way to combine them that I've had a hard time finding in other places. So this is not what this class is. It's not a class that's going to be science proves God is real, and it's not going to be a class that says like science is encompassed within God necessarily either. It's not about one owning or proving the other. That's not what's going to happen over the next 3 weeks. Disclaimer number 3, and something important to remember: correlation does not equal causation. We are going to spend a lot of time in this class talking about things that run parallel to one another, things that are really interesting. This does not mean that one causes the other. This goes back to number 2. This is not one proving the other. Sometimes things happen at the same time and they're not directly interacting. But remembering that correlation does not equal causation is really interesting because I'm going to spend a dangerous amount of time dealing with correlating factors. The reason is, my goal in this class is not to prove anything, to create new answers. My goal in this class is to make you say, If you say a lot, I've done my job, because is the sound of your mind opening up to new possibilities. And that's what my exploration into quantum physics did, and I hope it is what this class does for you as well. We're going to start off with a discussion today at your tables, because I want to see where we're starting from. So the question that I want you to turn to your tables and discuss, will take 5 to 7 minutes, is: do you believe in both God and science? If so, how? If not, why not? Then if that conversation starts to fade out before our time is up, feel free to turn to the second question: what barriers do you feel exist between faith and science? So turn to your tables, we'll take 5 to 7 minutes, I'll kind of gauge the conversation, and go ahead, and then I'll hear from you after. Okay, 30 seconds to wrap up your thought. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Sounds like we had a lot of good conversations. I'm going to ask my lovely assistant, Becky, to grab this other microphone and run it around. Who heard something that was interesting at their table? Anybody? Okay, back there. Yeah, right into the microphone. Somebody.
We just talked about areas where faith and science are perceived to disagree or be in conflict. We talked about the creation myth. We talked about the literal understanding and maybe some discomfort with that between communion and this eat of my flesh, drink of my blood.
Yep. Yeah,
all of which are, yeah. I thought we had a lot of really good discussion around all of those points.
Yeah, thank you. Who else had the creation story come up in their conversation? Yeah, that's a popular one. Who else had a different? Who else had an answer they heard? Yeah, Tom, go ahead.
So we talked a little creation as well, and we said basically at our table that science is an attempt to explain the natural side of God. God is spirit, and that science itself doesn't the least bit threaten our belief in God. In fact, for us, it enhances it makes it more glorious. So.
Science enhances your understanding of God. Did anyone else have that thought come up at their table? Yeah, we did at ours. Yeah. What else? What else did we hear during that? Did anyone hear something they hadn't thought of before in their conversation? Yeah.
Oh, that's loud. I heard that it's a little more difficult for people who have a literal interpretation of the Bible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, literal interpretation.
It's a little easier for us.
Yeah, a literal interpretation of the Bible can make this more difficult. A lot of times I think it's because you're asking questions of it that weren't meant to be asked of it. Yeah. Anyone else have something they want to share from their conversation? Yeah, over here to Pat.
We wish that there was a better way to ask the question than do you believe in science?
Ooh.
Because we see science as an action word rather than as a system of a series of beliefs, principles, precepts. And by its very nature, science is meant to change as we learn stuff.
Yeah.
And so I used to teach a model of an atom that was little circles, you know.
That's what I learned.
And you know, that's a lie.
Yep.
It's all lies.
Yep.
And by the time I was finishing my teaching career, I would preface it with saying, okay, we're going to learn this because it's helpful to use this kind of a model, but it's not the way it really is. And the kids would go, what? So we don't think that believing in science is really, that captures our feeling.
Yeah, and it might even be a way we've been forced to misrepresent the question just to talk about it because of cultural impacts. Yeah, that's really helpful. That's interesting. Yeah, I will say that one of my biggest mind-blown moments during my study of excursion into quantum mechanics was going, wait, they taught me wrong in high school. And also, they knew they were teaching me wrong in high school because they've known this was wrong for 100 years. And that was the moment I was like, whoa, what else aren't they telling me? Which only made me need to dig deeper. Thank you, everyone. Thanks for diving into that a little bit. I think it's interesting to see where we start from. Part of my motivation for a class like this is because I sense that there's a lot of Christians where, and I think St. Andrew's is actually a bit of an exception to this, because I think we have a lot of scientific-minded people and a lot of people with a lot of deeper theological understanding than a lot of Christians do. I think a lot of Christians in traditions where it's a fairly new thing to accept science and your Christianity together, how you mesh those comes down to something really simple, like, well, God made science, and it's like, that's great and maybe true, but it doesn't demonstrate like a comprehensive understanding of how do we actually integrate these two practices, and how can we explain it to people so that they understand. So that's one of my reasons for this class, is I hope to offer some language, some stories, some ideas that might open up the possibilities of ways you can yourself, or maybe share with others about how we can integrate these two different practices. So we get to the theme of the day, which is the breakdown. going to start by telling you the story of actually the day after my 13th birthday. I came home from school, and I had my backpack on, and I walked in the front door, and my dad was sitting on the couch watching ESPN, which I love to do with him after I got home from school. So I sat down, plopped my backpack next to me, and started to watch the show, and my father said, "Go put your stuff away." This was not like my dad at all. I was like, what is wrong? What did I do? I don't know what I'm in trouble for. I don't know what's going on. But I said, okay. I got up, I grabbed my backpack, went to my room, and when I walked into my room, there was a surprise waiting for me. A guy named Matt, who was basically like my big brother, one of the young adults from our church, was waiting in my room with a drum set. And it was my first drum set. It was a birthday gift from him to me. It's the one he learned on, and he had it set up in my room for me to learn how to play the drums. And I was just overjoyed. And I sat down, and for the next about hour and a half, he gave me my first ever crash course in how to play the drums. And it was fantastic. While that was happening, my little sister Brenna and my parents went to the hospital because they'd gotten a call from the doctor. And Brenna had been sick for a little while, and we weren't quite sure what was going on. Like we thought maybe it was a virus she couldn't kick or something, but weird stuff had been happening, like passing out, sometimes passing out in her own vomit, and it was scary stuff. So just after my first ever drum lesson started, my parents got a call, and they went to talk to the doctor, and the doctor said, Brenna has acute lymphoblastic leukemia. You need to get her to the hospital in Boise immediately, and the nurses will be waiting for her on the 3rd floor. So I came out of my first ever drum lesson, and my mom and dad were sitting there saying, hey, we need to go to the hospital. Someone's going to come over and stay with you. We're going to be there a few days at least. Brenna has cancer. And I was the only one of my siblings who was old enough to know about cancer. Like my other siblings were too young. They didn't understand what leukemia was. And they left for the hospital, and I went back into my room, and I grabbed my drumsticks, and I just blasted rock music, and I drummed until my fingers ripped open and bled. My family a few years earlier had moved across the country, actually probably only about a year and a half earlier, had moved across the country from the Kansas City area to Eastern Oregon, where we had planted a church. We had uprooted our entire lives to plant a church, not just any church. In fact, we actually were breaking the rules of church planting by planting in a rural town rather than an urban city. And it involved a lot of risk. We were living off of people back in Kansas City who believed in us donating at this point to the church and making it viable. And our entire life had been a leap of faith. And it wasn't just a decision that mom and dad made, but this was a decision that kids made with them. And in my brain, when Brenna got cancer, I was like, that's not how the world works. That's not how God's supposed to work. Not a good God. We did everything. We gave everything. We took the biggest risk. We acted in the total faith. And yet you give us cancer? That's not how it's supposed to work. Now, I can say a couple things on the other side of this story. One is that Brenna is 24 years old now, and has been fully recovered, has been in remission for, since their probably 9th birthday. So that's a huge joy, and I'm really grateful that I get to be able to say that. But on the other side, that day was the start of my deconstruction, because my understanding of who God was, how God worked, how our world worked, and in relation to God, shattered by that moment. That's why today is called the breakdown, aka a deconstruction. There are moments as human beings, moments that happen in our lives, moments that happen in history, where something happens that is so far outside the realm of what we think should happen that it shatters our perception of the world we live in. It makes us think it has to be different than this. We have to throw this out, and we have to do something else, because this clearly doesn't work anymore. This actually works in a couple different arenas. This works scientifically. We do this all the time scientifically. This is part of the scientific method. It also happens theologically, because we do this all the time as well. We say, well, we think God works like this. We think God thinks this. We think God wants this. And then something happens in the real world and we go, God doesn't want this. I know it. I just know deep down God doesn't want this. So we change. We look for something different. Sometimes deconstruction as a process can feel like we're going backward, but actually, I think deconstruction takes us forward. It's kind of a one step back in order to go 2 steps forward. You have to tear down, build a stronger foundation so you can build something heavier, more sturdy on top of it. The last 200 years, and we're going to talk about this for most of the rest of today, and other points in history as well, have had parallel breakdowns in Christian and scientific thought. Remember disclaimer number 3, correlation does not equal causation. However, I think these things are really interesting, and this is what I want to talk to you about. We're going to start going back to just before the Enlightenment with the Reformation and the Scientific Revolution. The Protestant Reformation happened from, now dates for these, it depends on how you qualify it, but generally 1517 to 1648, beginning with Luther's 95 Theses, and then we have some other key events that we'll review here. King Henry VII splits with the Pope and starts the Anglican Church because he wants to divorce his wife. And then the Council of Trent is called by the Pope. Yeah, Elijah, do you have something to add? Henry VIII. Oh, thank you. I must have missed an I there. Thank you. Henry VIII. You're awesome. Look at you. That's a good student right there. Henry VIII splits with the Pope and starts the Anglican Church because he wants to divorce his wife. I slandered Henry VII there. The Council of Trent was called by the Pope, which led to some changes in the Catholic Church as what they would call part of their attempt at a counter-Reformation, to make some changes themselves and combat against the Lutheran movement and the Reformation movement. And then what people call generally the end of the Protestant Reformation is the 30 Years' War, which is largely fought between groups of Catholics, Calvinists, and Lutherans, and it was partially religiously motivated. Not entirely, but partially. Simultaneously, we have some key events happening called the Scientific Revolution, which is more broadly dated 1500 to 1700. And some of these key events will include names you might know. Copernicus theorized heliocentrism, which was a completely unthinkable type of idea that we aren't the center of our own universe, which some of us still are having a hard time grasping. But this idea that the sun is actually the middle and we all go around it was part of what Copernicus theorized in 1543. Francis Bacon, he established a new scientific method which he expounded upon throughout his career and generally has given us what we consider to be the scientific method today, even though we've added some pieces like having hypotheses to it now. But generally this idea that, what scientific method should be is to collect empirical data and then interpret that data without biases beforehand, that is what Francis Bacon helped give rise to as a scientific method. Galileo invents his powerful new telescope in 1608, and then over the next couple hundred years, there's just incredible advancements upon his design. In 1666, Isaac Newton, apple on the head, actually that happened a few years earlier, but he wrote about it and published it, The Laws of Motion and Gravity in 1666, which are famous. And then in 1674, we see single-cell organisms observed underneath a microscope for the first time. What's interesting here is these are happening together, and again, correlation does not necessarily cause causation. There are Christians, though, that are a big part of the scientific revolution. They are, some of them on here are, some aren't. Francis Bacon is an atheist, Isaac Newton, Galileo are Christians. But there was a large movement that started the scientific revolution of Christians who said, if there is a God, if there is a creator, then by studying creation, we can learn more about the creator. So many Christians are actually known as certain fathers of the movement of the scientific revolution. Then let's jump forward a couple years and look at the last couple hundred. Let's start with talking about the deconstruction in religion. We know about a lot of this. Some of us have lived a lot of this, so I won't go too deep. But we'll start with in late 19th century, we see biblical criticism starting to take rise. This is the radical idea that the Bible was written historically in a historical setting, and that we should examine it as such in order to best understand it. So this means, trying to figure out who was the author, What would that author's motivations and intentions have been? What kind of sources were used to compile this? Was it completely original? Did it come from different places? How did the translation come about? Is it accurately translated? Are there multiple different translations out there that we need to try to make sense of? They do it different ways. This is biblical criticism, and it was considered at the time an incredibly radical new thought, and which is why it's called criticism, in fact. It was dealt with as being very critical of the Bible at times in a very negative context, which is why some Christians who were threatened by this approach thought that it threatened the holiness, the value of the Bible, the perfection of it. Actually started probably in the early 20th century, the fundamentalist movement, the idea that Christians need to get back to the very basics of the faith, including a very literal interpretation of the Bible. Another factor that played into that was Darwin's On the Origins of Species, which was published in 1859. This is where the theory of evolution was published. And this changed, in some people's minds, or challenged, the literal interpretations of the Genesis account. This created, and we're going to dive into this more next week, this chunk of things, but this created a lot of theological questions. One that I mentioned in our table discussion was, if we descended from chance, from evolution, from a past primate who was an ancestor of ours genetically, then are we designed perfectly by God? And do we still have that same level of purpose? This was a significant theological question that came about as a result of Darwin's On the Origins of Species. And this all came to a head in American culture in the Scopes monkey trial, which we're going to talk about more in depth next week. But it was the moment where secularism and Christianity clashed, and it came about over, like in many of our table conversations, the Genesis 1 creation account was at the heart of it, and it led to a massive schism in American culture. Another place where we've seen Christian deconstruction is death of God theology. This is the idea that not that God is literally dead, not that like a God has died. It is the idea that a theistic God, a personified, a personal deity, has no more relevance when engaging with it, when put in the context of a modern society. This is an idea that was probably first started by Nietzsche, but it actually really picked up after World War II in a lot of significance. Dietrich Bonhoeffer is often credited, his ideas are credited as part of this movement. I'm not sure Bonhoeffer himself would have actually said it, but his ideas are of a practical, of a worldly Christianity are often brought in as part of this conversation, when in the wake of Nazism, of the Holocaust, of atomic bombs being dropped on civilians, people said, wait, our idea that there's like a God who sees and loves and then intervenes sometimes doesn't make sense anymore. It doesn't work when we put it up against this modern world, this modern reality. So this is what's known as the death of God theology, and it's a significant deconstruction. It isn't, however, doesn't mean atheism. The death of God doesn't mean atheism, but what it does mean to a lot of people is the reimagining of what a God might be. That is not that. That is not the classical theistic personified deity, because they're saying that doesn't work anymore. We need something else. The Second Vatican Council is another moment of deconstruction. In fact, I think this one was largely positive, where the Catholic Church introduced reforms to modernize its teachings, such as allowing Mass in local languages. No longer did everyone have to learn Latin or just sit through a service that they didn't understand. And they promoted interfaith dialogue. This includes significant increase in dialogue between Catholics and Lutherans. And they also opened themselves up to potentially reinterpreting some biblical texts. Finally, the most recent is the ex-evangelical movement, where evangelicals are becoming former evangelicals, leaving their churches, a lot of times to become people who are spiritual but not religious nowadays. There are some famous leaders of this movement. Rob Bell, Brian McLaren were big starters of that early movement. And a lot of it has actually come out of a rebellion against, in the 70s and 80s, the merging of evangelical Christianity with extreme right-wing politics following the civil rights movement. So these are some of the most significant moments. There are many, many more of Christian deconstruction over the last 200 years. Now we're going to talk about the deconstruction in science over the last 150 years or so. Actually, closer to 200. I tried to figure out a way to teach you quantum physics today, but like I said, remember disclaimer number one, I am not a science teacher, much less a quantum physicist. And I was like, you know what? I'm going to let a professional do it. So we're going to watch a video together. It's about 9 minutes long, and it just has to be. And what it's going to do is explain the double slit experiment, which is probably the most important or influential experiment over the last couple hundred years, and what it does is it introduces the key questions at the very origin of the movement of quantum mechanics. So I'll let the pro start explaining this, enjoy this video, and then I will come back and we'll break it down together on the other side. Anyone else go during that? It gets me every time. I put this quote at the start of this: as our circle of knowledge expands, so does the circumference of darkness surrounding it, which was said by Albert Einstein, probably. The double slit experiment asks a bunch of fundamental questions that started the race that is quantum mechanics. And in fact, we've spent the last 120 or so years simply trying to interpret those results and figure out why is it doing all the weird things that it's doing. Some of the questions that come about from the double slit experiment, and remember to think this is all deconstruction, right? Because this is all things not happening the way we think they should. One of them is called wave-particle duality, which is just this idea that, okay, some things that we thought were particles, that were single things in a single place, sometimes are not. Sometimes they're acting like waves in multiple places at once, and they move and they act like waves, and we don't think they should until they show up like particles again. And trying to figure out, how do they do both? We don't know. How does it happen? But we know that it happens as a result of this experiment. Another question that comes about is the mystery of quantum superposition, which I am not a science teacher nor a quantum physicist, but I will try to explain briefly. I was told to introduce Schrodinger's wave equation today, which I don't understand. But basically, one interpretation of what's going on with the particles in this experiment by Schrodinger was that the particles must be, when they are a wave, they must be some sort of probability wave, in fact. An idea that it exists, that somehow the particle exists in all the places at one time, but it's just a matter of probability of where it's going to actually show up when we ask it, when we look for it, when we measure it. Other than that, until we measure it, that there's just a probability. We can guess where it's most likely to be, but we will not know 100% certainly. He actually ended up posing, kind of to highlight the absurdity of this understanding, the Schrodinger's cat thought experiment, which is the idea that if you put a cat in a box that was sealed with a vial of poison that would break at a random time, that the cat, until you open the box, should be thought of as both alive and dead. And that is the absurdity of thinking about atoms in this way, that you would, or particles, that you would think, well, until we measure them, they are all of these things. We don't know which one it's going to show up, so we have to think of it as all of them if we're going to try to think about it accurately. Make sense to anybody? Good, me either. Another question that this experiment brings about is something called the collapse of the wave function. Something happens where this wave, this probability wave, or whatever kind of wave it is, because we see it's clearly acting like a wave sometimes, but then it becomes a particle. It becomes one place. Something happens to cause that change. We don't know what does it. It seems to happen when we ask a question of it. It seems to happen when we measure it. Some people say when we observe it, which opens up questions of how much is what we do, our interaction with the universe, actually creating the universe itself. There are different interpretations trying to understand this, but this is the question that asks, is what collapses that into one? And Einstein famously hated this. In fact, it's one of the worst. If you look back on Einstein's life, he was not able to get on board with quantum physics ever because he just could not get on board with this idea, the collapse of the wave function. He said, I like to think that the moon is still there even when I'm not looking at it. That the observer or the measurement can't be the maker of reality. Reality has to be concrete. It has to exist despite. It opens up a whole new meaning to the question if a tree falls in the forest and no one's around to hear it, right? Yeah, Steve, would you run a mic over to Steve?
Another of Einstein's famous quotes is, God doesn't play dice with the universe.
God doesn't play dice with the universe. Yeah, again, refuting the probability, that he hated the idea that probability would be the deciding factor of what happens on a molecular level in the universe. Would you run this back to Tom, please?
So, and I don't proclaim to be an expert on quantum mechanics either, so I've studied it some.
No one should, right?
Right. Yeah. What might help with this, just a teeny bit, the observation aspect of it, is going back to the teacher of the atom and the electrons going around the nucleus of the atom. And true, electrons have different patterns of orbitals, not just this circle that we all learned about in school. But if you wanted to try to observe that electron going around the nucleus, you'd have to have some kind of sensor. Does everybody agree with that? Whether it's your eyeballs or a microphone is a sensor, for goodness sakes.
Sure.
And so how would we sense an electron going around the nucleus of an atom? Well, you'd have to have some kind of very, very sensitive sensor. In fact, if you could, in your mind's eye, if you can imagine a real tiny needle, and we're going to put it right next to where the electron's going around the nucleus. Everybody with me on that? So the electron is a electrically charged, negatively charged particle, and when it goes around and gets close to that needle, it creates a signal, a very small electrical signal that we could read. Does that make sense? Here's the issue, though. So we try to observe where is that electron right now. We place the sensor. We want to figure out the position of that electron. And we also want to know something like the momentum. So all of these properties are called the quantum state. Okay. We want to try to figure out its position. Here's the problem. When the electron goes close to that needle, everybody see that really small needle? We're trying to get a signal from it. Because that electric object goes by the needle, that little metal needle picks up a little electrical signal, and we go, oh, there's the electron. The problem is, the second you observe it, some of the energy of that electron has been absorbed by the needle. The second you take away some energy, you change its state.
It changes.
So observation-wise, just by looking at it, we change the state. We've also seen that with bigger objects.
Sure.
Human beings have quantum states.
Yeah.
Okay? So that might help a little bit, but quantum mechanics still is mysterious.
Sure, it's not that it's a magical, like you look at something and it magically changes, but that there is a limitation of that we can't observe anything without interacting with it to some degree. We have to have some degree of interaction, and that changes the state, that changes systems. Yeah, thank you. That's a really important distinction. Yeah, can we bring it back over here?
Okay, another thing that can change the answer is the question you ask.
Yes.
That in college I did to go through the exercise of solving the Schrodinger's wave equation for the hydrogen atom with different questions to ask. One of which is, what's the most likely distance to find the electron from the proton? And that will give you the Bohr radius of the hydrogen atom. If you ask, what's the most likely point at which you would find the electron, you would find it right inside on top of the proton. It's a different question with a different answer.
That's very interesting. Different questions with different answers. This is the mystery of it all. I'm going to move on to the next thing for the sake of time, but we'll have more time to ask. And now you know, if you have more questions, by the way, you've picked out the people to ask in the room, right? You know who, it's not me. Don't come up to class and ask me these questions. I don't know them. There's another thing that came, it's another later variation of this, and this one I understand less, and we're not even going to dive into it this much today, but there's another variation of this experiment that was run in the last 50 years, which is called the delayed choice experiment, where basically the scientists said, after the particle has passed through the two slits, at that point, but before it hits the final wall, we will decide whether or not we wanted to observe it passing through the two slits. So there's a decision that is made after the particle should have made its choice about whether we wanted to observe it making its choice. And what we find is the result on the wall is based upon the choice of the scientist. Somehow it appears, and this has been verified in other experiments, that a measurement in the present can determine, not explain, determine how a particle behaved in the past. It almost seems like time travel. It's baffling. Quantum deconstruction continued. This is stuff that's not directly related to the two-slit experiment, but other stuff that we've learned in the last last 100 years or so. One is called quantum tunneling. This is where electrons can actually move from place to place, even through energy barriers, without traveling the distance in between. At least not as we think about it. It's not exactly teleportation, but it sure looks like it. And we have no idea how it works. We know that it works. It is utilized in technology today. It helps us create really, really sensitive sensors. It helps us learn more about the subatomic world. But we still don't know how these atoms can decide based on their probability waves or whatever to go from one place to the other without apparently traveling the space in between, even through barriers. There's also quantum entanglement, which is where pairs of subatomic particles can have invisible, seemingly instantaneous connections. Tom mentioned that subatomic particles have different states, and subatomic particles, they're often called spins, which doesn't mean rotation, but it's what we're going to use because it's what we think of when we say spin. And what they found is when you find a quantumly entangled pair of particles, they can be far, far apart. We could have one in New York City and one here in Portland. And if you were to interact with the one in Portland in a way that changed its spin, the one in New York would instantly change its spin to match. With no apparent communication between them, happening so quickly that some scientists even wonder, does it break the law that nothing can travel faster than the speed of light? It happens so fast. This is a central component of what's making quantum computers nowadays, is these quantumly entangled particles. Again, we don't know how this happens. We know that it happens. We can make it happen. We can find it a lot, and we utilize it in massive technology right now, and a huge boom that's going to change our world. We still don't fully understand how it happens. And this one's even crazier. This is like the other last one. I'm not going to get into it deep because I don't understand it at all, but there are these things called quantum fluctuations, which under certain conditions, like in a vacuum or like in a massive collision in a large hadron collider of particles, pairs of quarks and antiquarks, which are the most fundamental particles of matter, very, very tiny. They can spontaneously appear out of the energy that existed there or disappear into the energy, I guess. We don't know where they come from, where they go, but it seems like something coming into existence and coming out of existence in a way that we have never witnessed on the larger scale. So here's the breakdown. As human beings, there are moments in life and history where what happens is so far outside the realm of what we think should happen that it shatters of our perception of the world we live in. This is part of the human condition. Remember, correlation does not equal causation, but it is fascinating to see how these two things have been happening so rapidly over the last 200 years. To be human is to search for meaning and for purpose. I put that quote on the screen at the beginning: faith is to be awake, and to be awake is for us to think, and for us to think is to be alive. Religion helps us ask questions like, who are we? Why do we exist? And science helps us ask questions like, what are we, and how do we exist? And to have one without the other, I think, is to settle for half of the picture, to see incompletely. You would be silly to turn, and in fact, oftentimes we have looked absurd, Christians have looked absurd, trying to take religious answers and apply them to the questions of science and vice versa. They don't work that way. They're half or a part of the picture. My argument is that science and religion are like two woven strands of the same cord. In fact, I think there's a third cord in there, which is called wisdom, which no one really has a beef with, so we're not going to deal with wisdom too much, because wisdom gets along well with everybody. But I think that there's a weaving that's happening, where they're combined together in one movement. You can think of it almost like we think of the Trinity, where there are different aspects that are all part of the same whole, that go the same direction together. Probably to this end of, at the very core of our humanity, is searching for meaning and purpose, figuring out who we are, what are we doing here in this big, crazy, beautiful universe. That's the question. That's the question of this class. And that's what I hope over the next couple of weeks we'll explore some other really interesting parallels and other things that have happened in history and over the last couple hundred years that will hopefully expand our mind into new ways of thinking about all of these things together. So Does anyone have any questions that you should ask me and not a scientist? Yeah, we got one back here.
I'm going to suggest that instead of talking about science and religion, we talk about science and the divine.
I like that.
Religion is a practice, and there's multiple religions.
Yeah.
But the divine is over all of that.
Yeah. I think there's probably the need for both. Yeah, I think we probably need to talk about both of them. Thank you. Steve?
I just have to add one thing about electron tunneling.
Yes.
My background is not specifically physics, but electronic engineering, and there is an electronic component called a tunnel diode that depends on electron tunneling for its function.
Yep.
And an electron has a certain probability of being on the other side of an impenetrable barrier, and so if that wasn't actually a reality, our electronic devices wouldn't work.
Yeah.
It's really true that actually happens.
It is fascinating how, if you the more you get to know about it, how much of our technology, and this happens throughout history, a new wave of technology comes, and oftentimes it utilizes science that is reliable but not understood. And that is still happening today. We don't understand exactly how all these pieces work, but we're putting them together and creating technology that's going to be massive for humankind even before we understand exactly how it works, other than we just know that it works. Yeah. Any other questions or thoughts you want to share? We are past our time, so I don't want to keep you too long. Okay. Thank you, everybody. Thanks for coming. I hope you come to the next couple weeks. We're going to keep having some fun and nerding out. Thank you.